All right, get ready because we're about to take a deep dive into some seriously heady stuff today. We're going all the way back to ancient Greece to explore a group of philosophers known as the Dialectical school. These thinkers were like the original logicians, obsessed with ideas about truth and possibility and necessity, all that good stuff, centuries before the Stoics even came on the scene.
And what's fascinating is that they were already way ahead of their time, delving into the complexities of propositional logic, like dissecting arguments and figuring out the building blocks of how we reason.
Yeah, and it's kind of crazy because they're a bit of a mystery even to this day. Our main guide for this deep dive is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, but even that leaves some pretty big questions unanswered. Like, were they really their own distinct school of thought, or were they just a branch of the Megarics?
It's a real philosophical puzzle. I mean, there was a ton of overlap with the Megarics, especially when it comes to their obsession with logic and paradoxes. Both groups could trace their philosophical lineage back to Socrates through Euclides of Megara, but some sources do try to separate them out, claiming the dialecticians were their own thing, active in the 4th and 3rd centuries BC.
So what kind of evidence points to them being a distinct school? Give me the juicy details.
Well, for one thing, there are references in ancient texts that specifically name-drop the dialecticians as a separate group, like Diogenes Laertes, who wrote biographies of a bunch of ancient philosophers. He lists them separately from the Megarics. And then there are these fun little anecdotes, like the one about Stilpo. He was a Megaric philosopher, and the story goes that he basically poached 3 students from the dialecticians.
Ooh, some ancient philosophical drama. I can just picture them now, throwing shade at each other's arguments over a symposium or something.
Right, totally. But even with all that, the debate still rages on. Were they actually distinct schools, each with their own subtle but significant differences? Or were they just, like, really close buddies in the world of philosophy, sharing ideas and interests? It's enough to keep scholars scratching their heads for centuries.
Well, rival schools or not, they were definitely pushing the boundaries of logic. The Stanford Encyclopedia article mentions they were already categorizing propositions, calling them simple and non-simple, and dealing with things like conditionals, disjunctions, conjunctions, the whole logical shebang. That's some pretty advanced stuff for their time.
Absolutely. They were already tackling those head-scratching logical puzzles that still keep us up at night.
All right, so let's get down to brass tacks here. One of the big names from this group was Philo of Megara, and he had a rather interesting take on conditional statements. Those if A then B kind of statements.
Right. And Philo's approach to these conditionals was surprisingly similar to what we call material implication in modern logic. He argued that a conditional statement is only false if the first part, the antecedent, is true, and the second part, the consequent, is false. Any other combination and the whole statement is considered true.
So just to be sure I'm following, even if the first part of the statement, the antecedent, is totally out there, like if pigs fly, the entire conditional statement could still be true under Philo's view.
Exactly. Because for Philo, the truth of the whole thing hinges on that specific combo, a true antecedent and a false consequent. Anything else, and it gets a pass. It's true.
That's a pretty interesting way to look at it. But didn't the ancient Greeks have this whole thing about truth changing over time? Wouldn't that just throw a wrench in the whole conditional game?
Now, that's a great question, and it leads us to another fascinating aspect of ancient Greek thought. They didn't always see truth as this, like, fixed and eternal thing. Truth could be dependent on time and circumstance. So a statement that might be true at one point could become false later on.
Okay, yeah, now I see how things could get really messy really fast.
Oh, absolutely. It adds a whole other layer of complexity. And this is where another big name from the dialectical school steps onto the stage, Diodorus Cronus. And he had a very different and some might say even more mind-bending view of conditionals.
Ah, yes. Diodorus Cronus, the master of temporal logic. If I remember correctly, he believed that truth was, like, intimately connected to time and the whole idea of what's possible.
You got it. He took a much stricter approach to these conditional statements. For Diodorus, a conditional statement is only true if there's never a time when the antecedent is true and the consequent is false. This is closer to what we now call strict implication.
So let's go back to our if pigs fly example. Would that statement ever get the thumbs up under Diodorus' system?
Well, it depends. It depends on whether you think pigs could ever actually fly, even in some distant future or some crazy alternate reality. If the answer is a hard no, then the statement would be considered true for Diodorus because the antecedent would never be true in the first place.
So basically, Diodorus was saying the conditional statement is only legit if the antecedent and consequent are like locked in this cosmic dance, where the consequent always follows the antecedent no matter what.
You nailed it. And this gets to the core of Diodorus's philosophy. He believed that something is only possible if it either is true right now or will be true at some point down the line.
That's a pretty bold statement. I can already see how this could lead to some pretty heated arguments about free will and determinism.
Oh, you better believe it. And that's exactly where his famous master argument comes into play.
The master argument. Okay, now you've really piqued my curiosity.
Well, get ready for some serious mental gymnastics because this argument is one of the most debated and analyzed in the entire history of philosophy. Okay, so are you ready to tackle this master argument? This is where Diodorus really gets down to business with his view of what's possible, and let me tell you, it can get pretty intense.
I'm all ears. I've heard this argument have been puzzling philosophers for centuries, so I'm definitely up for the challenge. Let's see what Diodorus has got.
Well, the first challenge is just figuring out what the argument actually was. We don't have the full thing directly from Diodorus. All we have is this summary from Epictetus, who was another philosopher writing a couple hundred years later. It's kind of like trying to put together a puzzle, but we only have half the pieces.
So we're basically philosophical detectives here, trying to crack the code of one of the most famous arguments in history, and all we have are these secondhand accounts. Talk about pressure.
Exactly. But even with those limitations, we can still get a pretty good idea of what Diodorus was trying to prove. He started with these three propositions that he considered like absolutely self-evident, no questions asked.
Okay, hit me with those propositions. Let's see what we're working with.
All right, so the first one is every past true proposition is necessary. This basically means that once something becomes true in the past, it's like it's set in stone, it can't be changed, it's a fixed and necessary part of reality.
So if it's true that I had cereal for breakfast this morning, that truth is now unchangeable. It's like eternally part of the past.
Exactly. The second proposition is the impossible does not follow from the possible, meaning you can't logically get to something impossible from something possible. Makes sense, right?
Yeah, that seems pretty straightforward. Like you can't turn a square into a circle no matter how much logical wizardry you try to use.
Right. Now, the third proposition is where things get a little spicy. It says, something is possible which neither is true nor will be true.
Hold on a second. Doesn't that totally contradict Diodorus' whole idea that something's only possible if it's either true now or it's going to be true in the future?
You're sharp. That's exactly the point. This third proposition is basically the opposite of what Diodorus is arguing for. It's saying there are all these possibilities floating around that will never actually happen, like unrealized potential, things that could have been but never were.
Okay, yeah, I see the tension here.
Mm,
So how did Diodorus deal with this apparent contradiction? Did he just ignore it?
not quite. He saw these three propositions as a kind of logical puzzle. And he thought he could use the first two propositions, which were pretty widely accepted, to disprove that third one and support his own definition of possibility.
So he was basically saying, hey, if you agree with these first two ideas, then you're logically boxed in and you have to reject that third one.
Exactly. And that's where the master argument comes in. It's his attempt to connect all the dots and show that if you accept those first two propositions, you have to conclude that nothing is possible that neither is nor will be true.
That's a pretty huge claim. So how did he actually go about proving that? What was his logical strategy?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Unfortunately, we don't have a step-by-step breakdown from the man himself. All we have is that summary from Epictetus, which gives us the main points but leaves out all the juicy details.
So once again, we're left playing detective, trying to fill in the blanks and figure out how Diodorus connected all the pieces.
Yep. And that's why the master argument has been such a source of fascination and debate for philosophers throughout history. There are tons of different reconstructions and interpretations out there, each trying to capture the essence of Diodorus's logic.
Can you walk me through one of those reconstructions just to give me a taste of how this argument might have worked?
Sure. Let's take a classic example that's often used to illustrate the argument. The proposition, there will be a sea battle tomorrow. Now imagine Diodorus saying that this proposition is neither true right now, nor will it ever be true.
So he's starting with the assumption that there's not going to be a sea battle tomorrow. Okay, I'm with you.
Exactly. Then he might use this principle that goes something like, if something is the case now, then it has always been the case that it will be the case. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it's basically saying that if something is true in the present, it must have always been destined to be true in the future.
So if it's true right now that I'm holding this microphone, Then from the perspective of the past, it was always inevitable that I'd be holding a microphone at this very moment.
Exactly. Now, let's apply that to the sea battle. If it's true right now that there will be a sea battle tomorrow, then it must have always been true in the past that there would be a sea battle tomorrow.
Okay, I'm following so far. Keep going.
But remember, we're starting with the assumption that the proposition there will be a sea battle tomorrow is not true. So if it's not true now, then it was never true in the past that there would be a sea battle tomorrow.
Right, because if it had been true in the past, then it would have to be true now, based on that principle we just talked about.
Exactly. And now we bring back that first proposition. Every past true proposition is necessary. Since it was never true in the past that there would be a sea battle tomorrow, then the proposition, there will be a sea battle tomorrow, is impossible.
Because it was never a necessary truth in the past.
Precisely. So even though it might seem like there's a possibility of a sea battle happening tomorrow, Diodorus is saying that if it's not true now, then it was never a genuine possibility to begin with.
Wow, okay, that is some next-level logical maneuvering.
Yeah.
I have to admit, it's still a little hard to fully grasp.
I don't blame you. It definitely takes some brain power to unpack. But that's what makes Diodorus's master argument so fascinating. It forces us to really grapple with some fundamental questions about time, possibility, and the limits of our logic.
It's like he's suggesting that the future is already set, in a way. If something isn't true right now, then it was never a real possibility in the first place. It makes you think.
That's one way to interpret it, and it's definitely a controversial view. It brings up all sorts of questions about free will and whether our choices really have any impact if the future is already predetermined.
This is giving me a serious existential crisis. Okay, so we've tackled the master argument, and I'm starting to see how Diodorus's view of possibility leads to some pretty radical conclusions. But there's another argument that's often associated with the dialectical school that also plays with these ideas of time and what's possible. The Reaper argument. Have you heard of this one?
Ah, yes, the Reaper argument. This one is just as mind-bending, and it takes a slightly different approach to messing with our intuitions about future possibilities.
Well, I'm always up for expanding my philosophical horizons, even if it means risking a brain meltdown. Bring it on. Tell me about this Reaper argument. What's it all about?
The Reaper argument uses this really vivid analogy to kind of explore what future possibilities really are. So picture this. You're a farmer, right? And you're standing in a field that's totally ready to be harvested.
Okay, I can see it. Golden wheat, bright sunshine, blue skies. It's all very peaceful, very zen.
Okay, now here's the question. Is it really possible that you both will and won't reap that field?
That's a good one. It feels like logically it has to be one way or the other.
Yeah.
Right? Like either I grab that scythe and get to work or I just don't.
Exactly. And that's precisely the intuition that the Reaper argument is playing with. It's suggesting that this idea of perhaps, that uncertainty about what might happen in the future, it doesn't really make sense when you're talking about future events.
Because the future is already predetermined in some way. That sounds like we're getting back into that whole determinism thing again.
Right. The argument basically goes like this. If you're definitely going to reap the field, then it's not really possible that you both will and won't. You're going to do it no matter what. And on the other hand, if you're definitely not going to reap the field, well, then again, it's not possible that you'll both do it and not do it. You just won't.
Okay, so it's like this logical trap where no matter what choice I make, the idea of perhaps just gets squeezed out.
Exactly. The Reaper argument is trying to say that there's no such thing as genuine contingency when it comes to the future. It's suggesting that everything's already locked in, even if we don't know what the outcome is yet.
So is this argument saying that free will is an illusion? That our choices are meaningless because the future is already set?
Well, that's where things get really heated in the world of philosophy. There are, as always, tons of counter-arguments and ways to poke holes in this argument. Like, for one, the whole thing hinges on the idea that future events are already fixed and determined, and not everyone buys into that.
Right. What if the future is still open and fluid and our choices really do influence what happens next?
Exactly. Plus, there are other ways to interpret the Reaper argument, too. Some scholars think it's not so much about proving that everything's predetermined, but more about highlighting the limits of language, like how we struggle to talk about these really complex ideas of future possibilities.
So maybe the word perhaps is just too simple too imprecise to really capture all the nuances of what might or might not happen in the future.
Maybe. It's really fascinating to see how these ancient philosophical debates are still so relevant today. We're still wrestling with these big questions about free will, determinism, and the very nature of time itself.
It's kind of mind-blowing to think that these thinkers from centuries ago were already grappling with such complex, challenging ideas. But I have to ask, was this Reaper argument actually Diodorus Cronus's work, or was it someone else in the dialectical school?
Well, that's another one of those mysteries that keeps scholars up at night. Some folks think it fits in perfectly with Diodorus's overall philosophy, while others think it was cooked up by someone else in the dialectical school. Unfortunately, the historical record is a bit fuzzy on this one.
Talk about a philosophical cliffhanger. It seems like the dialectical school is just full of these intriguing puzzles and unanswered questions.
Well, that's part of what makes them so exciting to study. They left behind this incredible legacy of arguments and insights that still challenge us to think deeply today. Even if we don't have all the answers, their ideas push us to be more critical and more creative in how we approach these big questions about truth, possibility, and the limits of human knowledge.
Well said. I think it's safe to say we've reached peak brain melt for one episode. But in a good way, of course.
Huh. It's always a blast diving into these philosophical depths with you.
Right back at you. And a huge thanks to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy for giving us this peek into the world of the dialectical school. And to you, dear listener, for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep those philosophical gears turning.